Good evening. My name is Andrea Barnwell Brownlee, and I am the George W. and Kathleen I. Gibbs Director and CEO of the Cummer Museum of Art and Gardens. Thank you for joining us tonight. Last Friday, the Cummer Museum opened American Perspectives, Stories from the American Folk Art Museum. I'd like to take a moment to thank Jason T. Bush, the Director and CEO of the American Folk Art Museum, who championed the Cummer Museum's presentation of this special exhibition from the very beginning. I'd also like to acknowledge the entire Cummer Museum staff and the Board of Trustees for their support and ongoing enthusiasm for this exhibition. I'd also like to thank Holly Karras, the J. Wayne and Dolores Farr Weaver Chief Curator, and the curatorial team for bringing this exhibition to fruition. The Cummer Museum's presentation of American Perspectives is made possible by Art Bridges. And although it's only been on view for less than a week, it has already delighted and compelled and also just really moved our visitors. It will be on view through May 22nd. However, I'm advising everyone to run, not walk, to experience this exhibition. But tonight you are in for an exceptional treat. We are so very, very pleased that Emelie Gevalt will present a lecture on this meaningful exhibition. A bit more about Emelie. Emelie is the curatorial chair for collections and curator of folk art at the American Folk Art Museum, where she most recently coordinated American Weather Vanes, The Art of the Winds, and also organized the traveling exhibition, American Perspectives. In addition to her work, Gevalt is a doctoral candidate in American art history at the University of Delaware, where her scholarship has been supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Often looking at earlier material through the lens of 20th century histories of collecting and collective memory, her work encompasses research interests in 18th and 19th century American portraiture, decorative painting, the colonial revival moment, and African American material culture and representation. Her dissertation is entitled Unseen New England, Identity and Exclusion in 18th Century Vernacular Art. Gevalt received her BA in Art History and Theater Studies from Yale University and her MA from the Winterthur Program in American Material Culture. Her research has been supported in part by grants from the Craft Research Fund and the Decorative Arts Trust, and has been published by the Chipstone Foundation. She has previously held positions at the MFA Boston and at Christie's New York, where she served as a vice president and senior account manager in the Estates and Appraisals Department. Please join me in welcoming Emelie Gevalt. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for that warm welcome. And I want to extend my thanks to your whole team, including especially your curatorial team led up by Holly Karras for all of the work that they have put into this exhibition and for inviting me to join you all this evening. I'm thrilled to be here to speak with you about American Perspectives, Stories from the American Folk Art Museum collection, which was originally curated for installation at the American Folk Art Museum in New York by Stacy C. Hollander, with support provided by Art Bridges, as Andrea mentioned. And the tour was coordinated by me. I'm just going to take one moment to pull up my slideshow here so we can talk about some objects. And I'll just start with a very brief overview of the exhibition, which I really encourage you all to see in person as soon as you can. But American Perspectives is fundamentally a show about stories and about how those stories illustrate the diversity of American experience. At the American Folk Art Museum, the expansive and inclusive scope of our collection goes beyond the fine art and decorative arts made by academically trained artists to embrace a wide range of objects that were made by people with different forms of training, often working within their local communities for patrons who were also their neighbors or friends or family, or even just for themselves. The show is entirely drawn from the permanent collections of the American Folk Art Museum and pulls together a truly incredible range of objects including traditional artistic formats such as portraiture and landscapes, as well as everything from quilts, decorated furniture, stoneware jugs, and carousel horses, some of which we will look at this evening, which really showcase the broad scope of how Americans have used their creativity to express their identity in all kinds of ways across time and place, across 4 centuries encompassed by the museum's collection from the 18th century into the 21st. The show also incorporates subjects and artists from a range of backgrounds, reflecting the diversity of the American population, as well as the diversity of media used by artists, often referred to as folk or self-taught artists. Since there are far too many works in the show to discuss in the context of my short talk this evening, I'll be taking you through the stories behind just a few that I've chosen as variations on the themes of the show and this theme of storytelling. And among them are some of my personal favorites. So I hope you will enjoy these selections, but also be encouraged to see the exhibition in person at the Cummer, where you can experience over 80 of these dazzling, fascinating, and often highly personal and moving objects firsthand. So you'll see I've organized my talk in rough chronological order, which gives you a sense for the broad range of the historical time periods in the show. But the exhibition itself, you will see, is intentionally organized non-chronologically to encourage visitors to make connections between modes of creativity across time and place, which is a special goal of AFAM's and of the museum's collections. We'll begin with one of my own favorite works in the exhibition. Needlework pictures like this one from the 18th century provide a window into the lives of early American girls whose experiences often went unrecorded in documentary archives. In the 18th and early 19th centuries in particular, needlework was considered one of the most important educational tools for girls and young women, especially those from well-to-do families, especially in places like New England, as is the case with this example. So it was through hours of stitching that girls and young women absorbed essential values, not just of sewing, but of diligence and patience, in addition to the more basic proficiencies of embroidery work. In the case of samplers, girls also learned literacy and numeracy. You don't see any numbers or letters here, but samplers and needlework pictures did often include dates, the alphabet, the cardinal numbers, or signatures of the girl themselves. And all of these together, these values and these skills, would have been considered key to the formation of a girl's future household and to raising a family, which was really considered the central purpose of each girl's future. We don't know much about the maker of this work, but we know her name was Sally Hathaway, and she was only 12 years old when she created this picture, which is quite an ambitious example. We're not sure of exactly where she was educated, but due to the complexity of the work, it's likely that she wasn't doing this on her own at home. She was probably working under the guidance of a schoolmistress at a ladies' boarding school. The Hathaway family lived at various different points during Sally's childhood, including New York City and also Great Barrington, Massachusetts. So we believe that the picture could have been worked in a school in either one of those areas. These fashionably dressed figures standing amidst flowers and rolling hills with a willow tree in the background, these are all characteristic motifs for the time period, and they evoke themes of abundance and delight, which were often considered suitable for girls of this age who were preparing for courtship and for family life. In this picture, an unusual feature is this trompe-l'oeil drapery, which you're seeing framing the picture. And this really gives a theatrical flair to the work and suggests a certain pride in presentation. It was common for works like this actually to be framed and placed on display in the family home during this time period. So they, in some ways, could be considered works that were intended for a kind of public presentation for visitors to the public spaces of the family home. Another notable feature of this work is the black background, which is not unusual, but you do see it in particular regional styles. It's more common to find more neutral colored backgrounds or backgrounds that are also embroidered with sky and clouds and other features. Moving on to look at an example of furniture in the exhibition. Furniture was a really rich opportunity for the painted or otherwise decorated embellishment of everyday objects in the 18th and early 19th centuries. This blanket chest is actually one of the oldest works in the exhibition. And chests like this, which is a simple lift top, were relied on throughout the 18th century to store valuable household goods, in particular textiles, which were among the most expensive things that you could own at the time. If you look at 18th century probate inventories of household goods, you will find very often that someone's bed hangings are the most expensive item that they owned. So blanket chests like these were required to protect these valuable objects. They're often associated with young women who might have had a chest made for them to take into a new household when they were married. But this particular example, which was made in a Germanic tradition, this particular example we know was the property of a young man called Jacob Kniskern. And actually, if we look at a detail, you can see his name inscribed Jacob and then Kniskern on these two architectural panels, along with the date of 1778, which you can just see here. So it's thanks to these details, in part, that we can trace the chest to a particular region, the Schoharie Valley in New York, which is an area west of the Hudson River, where Jacob Kniskern and his family were respected members of the community. And as it turns out, 1778 was a big year for the family. Kniskern and his brother enlisted in the Patriot cause during this year. And actually, we know that Jacob was subsequently captured and marched to Canada, where he was able to make a dramatic escape from imprisonment on board a makeshift raft, only to return to his hometown to find that his community had largely been destroyed by British troops. But he would persist and go on to reestablish a stable life. And at the time of his death, he owned not one, but 7 chests. I think a real testament to resilience following a youth disrupted by war. This tavern sign is another example of what I like to call really the art of the everyday, the embellishment of everyday objects. This is an early 19th century object, and it provides a point of reference to the diverse ways that early Americans put their homes to use. So S.D. Plum, we know his name was actually Seth Plum. He was the owner of a house on Broad Street in Meriden, Connecticut, which also served as a tavern for many years. Houses and the tavern keepers often lived in their place of work. And in fact, the taverns looked very similar to houses. There was no purpose-built tavern making at that time, or it was quite unusual. So this sign was needed really to distinguish the building from other residences, so that travelers coming through town would know that they could stop in there for food and lodging as they passed through on the turnpike, which had just recently in 1799 been established in Meriden, Connecticut. And so you can see the word entertainment here. That just refers to food and lodging and nothing more, no dancing ladies at the Seth D. Plum Tavern, but nonetheless a welcome sight for a weary traveler. And the illustration here marks especially the tavern as a spot open to travelers by coach. From what we know about Seth Plum, he sounds like he was a respectable citizen participating dutifully in government, although his life was not easy. And in fact, both his wife and his infant son died years before he did. In addition, a second tavern in town may have given his business some competition. And in a circumstance that was not unusual for this time period, where people were really taking on whatever work they could to make a living, Plum ran a second business as a tinsmith. And this really shows that this was a period where multiple sources of income were often key to securing some measure of stability in life. Here's a really wonderful small object in the show. It is an elaborately decorated tune book executed in a style with bright colors and fanciful motifs. Watercolors like these have most often been associated with designs of Pennsylvania German communities. But actually, based on the contents of this particular tune book, we can surmise that its owner, Daniel Steele, was actually of Scotch-Irish heritage. And this is because the tune book contains some traditional tunes used in the 1650 Scottish Psalter. And the work is written in English rather than German, which was common for Pennsylvania German texts, also done in a brightly colored watercolor. The work is dated 1821 below Daniel Steele's name in another page of the book. We also see timely references within the illustrations, such as this depiction labeled as the young Napoleon. Now, Napoleon died in 1821. So this is an example of someone really being up to the moment with current events. In a beautifully decorated book like this, we gain an understanding of the sense, I think, of care and investment placed on the objects of everyday life during this period. And I'll share with you just another example of additional pages from the book showing decorative motifs that were popular, as well as just some really joyful experimentation with floral motifs, as well as geometry. I love this watercolor in our collection. It's by an artist named Deborah Goldsmith. And in fact, I'm delighted that AFAM has recently acquired some additional works by this remarkable young woman who very unusually earned a living as a professional painter during the 1820s. She lived in Western New York, and in the years before her marriage, so before she had other family commitments, the artist traveled among the neighboring communities of her youth, creating portraits. She was only around 15 or 16 when she was doing this and when she painted this particular example. So we think she probably must have known the sitters. It would not have been considered proper or safe for her to be painting strangers, especially in the context of their own home. So her social connections, her kinship connections would probably have promoted word of mouth to secure future commissions, and may also have lessened any sense of impropriety around the idea of a young woman traveling around and entering a patron's home. So during this time in the 19th century, whereas in the 18th century, portraiture was open more so to an elite urban clientele and was often executed in oil on canvas, watercolor portraits like this, very personal, intimate scenes, were quite popular during this time period of prosperity in American life, and when families had access to greater amounts of disposable income, and the watercolor medium allowed for a quicker to dry, more easily executed commission than did oil on canvas. Although Goldsmith did paint on oil, and we have now a couple of examples of her works on oil in the AFAM collection. In the works of other period watercolors, as well as Goldsmith, you can really get a sense for the exuberance of the domestic interior during this period. The decoration during this time period was often referred to as fancy, not as in sort of, elitist, but as in fanciful, whimsical, bright colors, lively patterns, like the ones that you're seeing here in the wallpaper and in the carpet, and totally contrasting. This was very, very much on trend at the time. A few notes about how it is that we know as much as we do about Goldsmith, because this is a really interesting aspect of her history. There's this a remarkable cache of materials that have survived relating to her career. In the early 20th century, a parcel of letters and an old leather traveling bag were discovered and revealed Goldsmith's history as one of the few women in this time period to work professionally as a traveling artist. The letters detail the intimate course of her courtship and her marriage and her untimely death. Sadly, she died when she was still in her 30s. And also in the satchel were a number of cylindrical tin canisters, which held small bladders filled with oil paints, little newspaper parcels containing watercolor pigments, which were powdered, and also handmade feather quill brushes. So we have this wonderful sense of really the material aspects of her career, as well as being able to see the result of her creativity. She also kept a kind of friendship album in which she made other drawings, not drawn from life, but after prints of sort of fashion plates and kind of romantic pictures that would have been available for her to copy, which was a common way for young people to teach themselves to draw. So here's another real example of kind of the beauty of everyday embellishment. Long before the invention of Tupperware, paint decorated tin like this was widely used to make containers of all kinds. And there was a bustling business for wares like this in the early 19th century. Aaron Butler, this particular tea caddy was made in the shop of Aaron Butler, who was a successful tinsmith originating from Berlin, Connecticut, which had been a tinsmithing center really since the 18th century. Butler eventually set up shop for himself in Greenville, New York, which is again a rural area of the Hudson River Valley. And like other craftsmen of the era that we've talked about already this evening, Butler pursued multiple trades. He was a tinsmith as well as operating a cider mill. He had a hay press and he was a peddler. He had a peddling business, which would have provided a perfect opportunity for him to sell his tin wares. But eventually he ran a general store and clients could actually come to him for a range of household goods. He enlisted his daughters to decorate the tin that he produced in his shop. Each of the Butler children attended Greenville Academy, which was founded in 1816, and it may have been there that they were instructed in ornamental painting techniques that were considered to be fundamental to young women's education. Butler had 3 daughters, but the best known is Anne, who signed her name. This is actually another example of a work in our collection that you can see here, the pride with which she inscribed her initials, putting them in the center of a heart. And she is actually someone who's gained a bit of recognition in the history of paint decorated tin due to this unusual practice of signing her work. This is not something you necessarily expect to see, but there are several different examples of tinware from the Butler shop in the exhibition. I've gone too far. You may be familiar with the name Edward Hicks, who is considered to be a canonical American folk artist, but he was not only a painter, he was also a preacher. He was a Quaker preacher, and the importance of his very deep faith comes through in his work, especially in the composition known as the Peaceable Kingdom, which you're seeing an example of here. When Hicks was just 21, he opened his own painting business, but he was discouraged by the Quaker community from pursuing subjects for his paintings which may have been considered too worldly. So he worked continuously with this religious theme, and it was between 1816 and 1818 that he took up this theme for the first time of the Peaceable Kingdom, which may be familiar to some from the Bible in Isaiah 11:16, in which the wolf also shall dwell with the lamb and the leopard shall lie down with the kid. So you're seeing examples of this here. We have the leopard and the kid, we have the wolf and the lamb, and we have the lion and the cow here, and they're all peaceably, harmoniously lounging together alongside human figures. Remarkably, Hicks painted this theme over and over again in 62 variations over more than 3 decades of his life. We might imagine that he found solace in these themes of peace and harmony, which were especially important to Quaker faith, and especially important during a moment of dispute in the Quaker community. This particular painting is not in the exhibition, but I will share with you this other work in AFAM's collections, which actually tells the story of Hicks's childhood in rural Pennsylvania. You can see this tiny little figure here is Hicks in the foreground of the family farm of his adoptive parents, the Twinings, referenced here in this original frame. And Hicks is here listening to his adoptive mother read from the Bible. This picture as well was repeated more than once in the course of Hicks's career. And I think we can also read here another reference to the peaceable kingdom with this group of animals who are lying down in a calm and peaceful scene. Now, the year that this watercolor was made, the recently incorporated town of Lowell, Massachusetts, was just at the beginning of its astounding period of industrialization, which was really a period of growth for the entire United States. But it was within this bustling atmosphere that a widowed mother named Phoebe Buxton, the mother of this boy here, found the means to support her young family by operating a boarding house. Our knowledge of the Buxton biographies is limited, but we can be sure that her little boy, Frederick, and her other children would have had their lives very much shaped by the daily activities of the mill in Lowell and the resident mill workers, many of them young women who had left family farms in rural Massachusetts for the first time and were experiencing some measure of independence as women out in the world. The faces of Frederick Buxton and also many of the young women who were working in the mills would likely no longer be available to us if it weren't for the work of the watercolorists, husband and wife team, Ruth and Samuel Shute, who offered their services reasonably priced, working in watercolor. So again, watercolor, a more accessible, less expensive, quicker medium. And they had a ready market in the form of the mill workers in booming mill towns like Lowell and elsewhere in New England. It was a bit unusual for a married couple to be working together, but we know a little bit about how their artistic partnership worked because of how they have signed some of their works. They've signed them in an indication that the drawing was executed by Ruth and then the paint was executed by Samuel. Also, in a fun little tidbit, there is a handwritten note that was discovered inside a Lowell city directory indicating that Samuel Shute lived at the Buxton boarding house in the 1830s. So providing a very likely context for the Shute's execution of this picture of young Frederick. Another fun characteristic of the Shute's work, which you can see here and which you can often recognize their work by, is this beautiful radiating background surrounding the boy. And then also these tiny buttons, which are actually made not of paint, but of foil, which bring a real shimmer to many of their works and are often, the Shutes often used gold foil to create details like these, including jewelry, earrings, necklaces, and buttons. This apparently simple stoneware jug is one of the most extraordinary objects in the museum's collection, in my view, because of its incredible story. This work was made by an enslaved potter, and so the piece was created in the context of a horrifying system of oppression that was fundamentally designed to dehumanize people, to deprive them of agency, and to remove the possibility of any sense of comfort, stability, and ownership that might be associated with a simple houseware like this. And yet, as this jug powerfully shows, even in this context, the enslaved potter known as David Drake, sometimes simply known as Dave, because that is how he signed his work, he was able to find ways of asserting creative agency over his work as a potter, and possibly to extend that sense of agency to other enslaved people who may have used his pots in the course of their daily work. So how did he do this? If you've heard of David Drake, you may know that he regularly inscribed his pots. You can see there's a name and date here. This is an incredibly unusual gesture for an enslaved artisan during a period and in a place when it was illegal to teach enslaved people to read. And Apham's jug only bears Dave's signature and a date, but other examples of his work bear longer inscriptions, including verses of poetry, some invoking stories from the Bible. And scholars have hypothesized that these inscriptions enacted a kind of resistance, allowing Drake to subvert the dehumanizing experience of enslaved labor, and even possibly to help familiarize other enslaved people with the written alphabet through their interaction with his jugs, which, although very likely sold to white-owned households, would have been carried primarily by enslaved workers. And we know, for instance, that Frederick Douglass achieved literacy, teaching himself to read using the Bible and drawing comparisons between what he was able to see on the page and the stories that he already knew orally. So some really interesting stories and ideas behind this simple work. And there's a lot of really exciting new scholarship that's being done around the work of David Drake right now, which will be culminating in an exhibition in New York in about a year's time. So look for that if you are a visitor to the city. The exhibition will be at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Here's an example of an oil on canvas. So a more traditional portrait medium than watercolor, and one executed by a canonical folk artist known as Emelie Phillips, who painted for more than 5 decades, from the years of the young United States to the aftermath of the Civil War. So an incredible lifespan in which he responded to his patrons' shifting desires over time. And the artist's work gave visual form to the expanding aspirations of land-owning families living primarily in the area in which he worked, along the border areas of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York. This particular picture, which is one of several works by Phillips in Apham's collection, portrays the 3 children of Henry Jocelyn Carter, who was the descendant of a prominent local family who ran a small boarding school in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. It's quite unusual to have a triple portrait like this, and we do know the names of all 3 children. They're Anna Electa, Mary Adele, and John Calvin Calhoun Carter, who are presented as dignified, but at the same time, lively, fresh-faced, capturing, I think, their youth's promise and the closeness of their family relationships. There's a really nice detail here of some of the things that, the way that they're leaning into one another and touching one another, but also each carrying attributes of youth and play. But beneath the surface of the painting are some more melancholy associations. Not pictured here is another son in the family whose name was Thomas. He was born in 1852, so just 8 years before this picture was painted, but he was no longer living at the time that the siblings were portrayed. In addition, according to family history, Anna Electa Carter on the left was born with a cleft palate, which you can just barely discern on the contours of her face. But in spite of the prejudices that would have been associated with physical differences during this period, she would marry and go on to have 3 children of her own. In 1883, Charles Carmel became one of a handful of Jewish woodcarvers who emigrated from the Pale of Settlement in Eastern Europe, which was the geographical boundary in which Jewish people were legally permitted to reside at that time. In the United States, they sought and often found greater liberties, tolerance, and success. And like several of his compatriots, Charles Carmel relocated to Brooklyn, New York, which was home to one of the most lavish and exciting amusement parks of the day, of course, Coney Island. Together, this group of carvers infused the American carousel with a dynamism and really an innovative approach that was characterized by the realism of their figures, such as the flying mane that you're seeing here and the open mouth, the detailed musculature, its ferocious expression, and lots of extravagant embellishments you can see here in these detail shots. Carousel carvings in the Coney Island, what's known as the Coney Island style, were actually distributed throughout New York City, which had almost 24 carousels, and also to the rest of the country. So this was really a trend-setting center for this kind of carving. We know that Charles Carmel lived and operated not far from where I live in Brooklyn, in a shop near Brooklyn's Prospect Park horse stables. So you can imagine that here he would have been able to observe his models from the life and really capture the beauty of form that he was seeing. He dreamed of having his own carousel one day, Carmel, but sadly this would never come to pass because the night before his carousel was to open in Coney Island, a fire destroyed the entire carousel. But we're grateful that some of his horses and other figures do survive as a testament to his skill. And you can see both from this photo, but also hopefully in person, the wonderful trappings of his approach here, including this bejeweled lattice work and beautifully rendered mane. So you may well be familiar with this next artist, Anna Robertson Moses, who became a household name under the nickname Grandma Moses. Actually, quite late in her life, she began her artistic career as a needleworker in a medium that would have been much more commonly accepted for a woman of her era, for she was actually born in 1860 and lived until 1961. But she didn't take up her artistic practice until she was already in her 70s. She was taking care of her sick daughter, and she found that arthritis was preventing her from continuing her needlework. So she took up painting during this time and would eventually become one of the best known and best beloved of American self-taught artists whose work is recognized around the world and has been imitated by many. She became famous really for nostalgic country scenes like this one, and I'll share a detail so that you can see some of the characters that she's created. This is a moment in American life when modern Americans were really seeking a kind of nostalgia, wanting to look back at a soothing vision of the past when life was supposedly simpler and easier than the World War II era in which these paintings were made. And there was a huge response to her vision. Consumers rewarded Grandma Moses with all kinds of accolades. Her work was featured in magazines, including Time and Life. Her work was reproduced on Christmas cards and all kinds of other forums. And President Truman even gave her a special award, in addition to the New York governor at the time, declaring a Grandma Moses Day on the occasion of her 100th birthday in 1960. Traveling further south, here we have an example of work by Clementine Hunter made in 1970. When Hunter was a teenager, she moved with her family to Melrose Plantation in Natchitoches, Louisiana. And this move would turn out to have important consequences for her. because the plantation's owner was running Melrose as a kind of artist's colony. For much of her working life, Hunter had worked in the fields or served as a cook or did other domestic work. But in her 50s, so again, as an older woman, she was inspired to take up painting when she was exposed to artist materials, some of which were left behind by artists in residence who had departed the plantation. Hunter had creative experience making things before, including quilts and clothing and dolls for her children, as well as baskets. But once she took up painting, she would go on to make thousands of pictures. And we have a number in our collection at AFAM. And their themes are these beautiful representations of daily life on the plantation, which she knew so well. This is a rare moment of leisure for the women who people Hunter's pictures. More often, she shows women and sometimes men at work in the fields. But with her work, she really brings a truth and dignity to the everyday activities of the Southern agricultural lifestyle that was fading into history during this time period. But you will find as you look at her work that her world was largely matriarchal, and women were typically very busy and they were the ones running things. But in this example, we do have an unusual moment of relaxation and play. The concept of a freedom quilt can be traced back at least as far as the Civil War, when women embroidered anti-slavery slogans and images into their needlework, which has long been, quilting has long been a medium or a vehicle for protest and self-expression. But this example was made in the 1980s. And the inspiration for it was born during the civil rights movement and also tells a civil rights story. In 1963, the maker of this quilt, Jessie B Telfair, attempted to register to vote. And as a result, she lost her job as a cook at an elementary school in Parrott, Georgia. Telfair had learned to quilt from her mother, which is a very common part of quilters' stories. These are traditions and techniques that are passed down over generations. And after the trauma of losing her job, Telfair was encouraged by members of the civil rights group known as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to use her skills to respond to what had happened to her. It wasn't actually until 1983 that she had processed this and decided to make several freedom quilts, but she powerfully responds to her experience through this bold repetition of the word freedom over and over again in big, bold letters. The horizontality of the word, along with the choice of the colors, red, white, and blue, mimic the stripes of the American flag and really make a very powerful statement. The last work that I'll share with you this evening before I open the floor to some questions is by an artist named Hijano Torres, who's a New Yorker of Puerto Rican descent, a living artist, and his work represents memories of his childhood time on the island of Puerto Rico. As was the case with the Edward Hicks that I shared earlier in our virtual tour, what we have here is actually a self-portrait of the artist on the left as a young boy, and he's sitting beside his grandmother and his sister. A portrait of his uncle, a war veteran, is hanging above the scene. And what I really enjoy about this work, which I have to say, you must see it in person because it's jewel-like. It's a tiny little work. It's 6 1/4 inches by 6 1/4 inches. And you really have to engage with it physically and come close to it to really appreciate its beauty. But you also see, as we saw in other works, such as the Deborah Goldsmith watercolor, the way that the patterns and forms of the domestic interior and of everyday life are really bringing together the composition and making it engaging. Here we also see the way that the shape of the love seat, flanked by these 2 tables, echoes the shape of the 2 children flanking their grandmother, forming a kind of upwards arrow towards the veteran who is the subject of the picture's title. So this emphasizes the importance of Uncle Juan here looking down on everyone, and also brings the family close together through a kind of echo of their forms through the furniture. It's really a luminescent picture, and I think creates a kind of sense of otherworldliness, a kind of dreamy quality that I think so often accompanies our memories of the places that are most important to us. So this wraps up my presentation of the exhibition, but I want to welcome you to ask questions. I see I have